Got it. Okay, so so this talk is going to cover this whole range of works. So we're starting with the kind of knockabout nursery rhymes of The King and Queen of Hearts, Charles's first publication for children in 1805, and moving to much more serious adaptations like the Tales from Shakespeare, the first major work commissioned by the Godwins. And that's never been out of print since its publication. And it served as the gateway to Shakespeare for countless 19th century readers, amongst them Edith Nesbit, Helen Keller, Mary Cowden Clark, also the means by which Shakespeare was first translated into Chinese. The Homer adaptation, Adventures of Ulysses, this time authored singly by Charles, actually inspired the schoolboy James Joyce. Then we've got the collaborative works, Mrs. Leicester's School and Poetry for Children, engaging works which very delicately allude to these issues of isolation, anxiety, grief and loneliness, and which show a remarkable acuity to the emotional needs of children. So from chapbooks to classics, there's a whole range of genre and form which the Lambs employ in speaking to children. And this edition is a chance to reevaluate the role of the Lambs in developing children's literature and thinking about the romantic culture of childhood. I think maybe one of the reasons in which why they've got disregarded is because there's a bit of a disconnect between these works, which Charles characterises to Coleridge as task work, which Mary describes to Sarah Stoddart as being taken on for money. And she says very proudly, I think I shall get £50 a year at the lowest calculation. And the romantic concept of childhood, that Wordsworthian emphasis on imagination and imaginative wildness in Lamb's writing elsewhere. Of course, there's one quotation everyone knows in relation to Lamb and children's writing, and that's his letter to Coleridge in October, it should be 1802, when Charles Lamb writes to Coleridge, robustly condemning the lack of good children's literature. I'm glad the snuff and Pipos' books please. He says, Goody Two Shoes, the old Newbery classic of 1965, is almost out of print. Mrs. Barbauld stuff has banished all the old classics of the nursery.
Felicity, can you just share your screen again?
I'm so sorry. I thought I was sharing. Let's have a look. Sorry. Thanks, Greg. Now, of course, it's not letting me find the thing that I wish to share. Let's have a... There we go. So just to go back and show you, since we missed that bit out, there's the chapbook of The King and Queen of Hearts. There's the classic, The Adventures of Ulysses. So I'm sorry you missed out on seeing those. And here's the long quotation that it's really useful to have on screen. So this should be October 1802. And he's writing to Coleridge. He says that I'm glad the snuff and Pipos' books please. Goody Two Shoes is almost out of print. So that must have been the Newbery classic that he was trying to buy for Pipos, Derwent, Coleridge. He claims to be out of patience with Mrs. B's and Mrs. Trimmer's nonsense. And I'm sure we all know this quote, but it is such a crucial one, I think, for understanding the kind of complexity of the Lamb's attitudes to children's literature. Knowledge insignificant and vapid as Mrs. B's books convey, it seems, must come to a child in the shape of knowledge, and his empty noddle must be turned with conceit of his own powers when he's learnt that a horse is an animal and Billy is better than a horse and such like, instead of that beautiful interest in wild tales, which made the child a man, while all the time he suspected himself to be no bigger than a child. Science has succeeded to poetry no less in the little walks of children than with men. Is there no possibility of averting this sore evil? Think what you would have been now if, instead of being fed with tales and old wives' fables in childhood, you've been crammed with geography and natural history. Damn them! I mean the cursed barbed crew, those blights and blasts of all that is human in man and child. And that quotation, of course, is so notorious as a romantic rallying cry for the imagination. And also it's quintessentially Elian, an expression of Lamb's creative frustration with the didactic strictures of moralist children's writers. It's had a disproportionate effect, I think, on the ways in which we've understood writing for children among his circle. And perhaps it's overshadowed our understanding of romantic children's literature more broadly. Indeed, Charles's comments have traditionally been set alongside Coleridge's celebrations of his own early reading of fairy tales, Wordsworth's images of childhood with freedom, to support, as Alan Richardson puts it, a persistent dualistic model, didacticism and imagination, instruction and delight, reason and fantasy, underlying most accounts of the development of children's literature. But of course, as Richardson's own analysis suggests, and as more recent criticism on the rise of children's literature is explored, there are no easy polarities here. For a start, the hyperbole of Charles's letter points up a certain tension around the power of wild imagination, and the Lambs seem to me to walk a tightrope in their life and in their works between the pleasures and the dangers of wildness, both keenly aware of the perilous nature of their own mental health. And in publishing with the Juvenile Library, they're taking part in a much larger debate over the nature and purpose of imagination in educational literature for children. In this specific letter too, Charles is engaged in an ongoing back and forth with Coleridge, especially regarding those barbed comments. And partly this is misogynist bravado. There's been that uncomfortable rift of 2 years between 1798 and 1800. And now Charles is trying to re-establish his friendship with Coleridge. He's aiming to recall the homosociality of their young London years together, fueled by tobacco and egg hot in the Salutation and Cat. His dismissal of Barbauld in particular serves to mark his awareness of Coleridge's growth away from dissenting allegiances. Yet, perhaps deliberately, it obscures the importance of this dissenting tradition in forming the Lamb's own approach to children's literature, just as, in a way, it silences Mary Lamb. We know Charles Lamb's vituperative comments so well, but Mary's presence in the scene is overlooked. Yet we might presume from that very specific request to the shopman that she had her own views about the sorts of literature which would be suitable for a child to learn to read. She had, after all, taught Charles, her junior by 10 years, and she would continue tutoring children until later in life. We hear that she's the one who asked Goody Two-Shoes, and her disapproval of the modern nonsense which lay in piles about is implicit, but only implicit. Charles has often been taken to speak for Mary, and we need to ask how far we should take this as Mary's view. And this is one of the aims of my volume. We need to recognise the deeply important and quite sophisticated collaborative practice of Charles and Mary, the ways in which they draw on one another as writers and respond to one another. But we also might need to ask how they differ as writers. How much have Charles's views been allowed to overshadow those of Mary? Can we really disentangle their voices? And who are they buying these books for? The books are destined for Pipos, Derwent Coleridge, for whom the Lambs had developed a particular affection as a result of their 3-week visit to Keswick in the summer of 1802, just before the child's second birthday. Particularly tell me about little Pipos, or Flying Opossum, the only child but one I ever had an inclination to steal from its parents. That one was a beggar's brat that I might have had cheap. And I hope his little rash has improved. Don't be jealous. I have a very affectionate memory of you all, besides Pipos. but Pipos I especially love. This shows the sort of domestic intimacy the Lambs enjoyed with the Coleridges. We often think about male homosociality and poetic collaboration. This shows a different domestic side, a real involvement in the child's life and sympathy with the infant Rashes. Interesting that particular affection is reserved not for the ethereal Hartley, to whom Lamb seeks elsewhere in the letter to be remembered kindly, but the more boisterous infant Derwent. He emerges very clearly from Sarah Coleridge's memoirs, who records her mother's memories of him aged 2, a fine, fair, broad-chested little fellow in a canary yellow frock, racing from kitchen to parlour and from parlour to kitchen, just putting his head in at the door with roguish smile to catch notice, and then off again, shaking his little sides with laughter. And this description comes from her memoirs. Mr. Lamb and his sister, who paid a visit of 3 weeks to my parents in the summer of 1802, were charmed with the little fellow and much struck with the quickness of eye and memory that he displayed in naming the subjects of prints in books, which he was acquainted with. Pipos, Potpos were his names for the striped or spotted opossum, and these he would utter with a nonchalant air, as much as to say, of course I know it all as pat as possible. Now, this is quite an interesting starting point for the letter, I think, when we put Pipos, little Derwent Coleridge, back into the context of Charles Lamb's comments, and we think about the real child who's exploring the books. And I think the book that he's exploring is probably a general history of quadrupeds with engravings by Buick. And for this, I'm grateful to Matt Sangster. Certainly the Buick book, it's speculation on our part, but the Buick book does date from the right period. It's a child-friendly volume with lots of lovely illustrations, and a family copy does exist. So we've got the spotted opossum and the flying opossum, which I think was the inspiration for the Lamb's Pipos nickname. Interesting to note Derwent's age here. He would be 2 in September 1802. The child readers of the Romantic period are infants, just learning their letters. The process of learning to read happens early, as indeed in Barbauld's books for infants of 2 to 3 years old. Think what you would have been now, Lamb had written to Coleridge, if instead of being fed with tales and old wives' fables in childhood, you'd been crammed with geography and natural history. But Derwent's love of the opossums show that geography and natural history run alongside fables and tales to contribute to the imaginative development of the child. And the joke of the letter, it seems to me, is partly the way Lamb's knowingly overstating his case in light of this. There's another figure in the letter, of course, an interlocutor who isn't mentioned, but who'd become crucial to the Lamb's works for children, because we need to read it as a product of conversation with the Godwins, with whom Charles and Mary were in close communication through this period. The Godwin diary shows that there was contact usually around once a week between 1800 and 1807, sometimes considerably more. And in September and October 1802, the time Lamb wrote this polemic letter to Coleridge, there'd been numerous meetings, including visits from both William and Mary Jane together at the beginning of October. These visits increased in frequency through 1803. In 1804, as the idea of one or both writing for the Godwins began to take shape, there are 78 separate mentions of the Lambs. So they're clearly working very closely together. And as such, I think we should see the Lamb's children's work as guided by the Godwins, despite Charles Lamb's overtly expressed contempt for Mary Jane. And the Godwins' publishing venture, as critics like William Sinclair, Don Locke, Susan Manley, Pamela Clement have noted, should be seen as having a serious ideological purpose. In Clement's words, far from withdrawing from public debate under the pressure of economic necessity, as is sometimes thought, Godwin turned to children's books as a continuation of his radical programme of the 1790s. By the early 1800s, the post-revolutionary idealism and purpose of Godwin's 1790s, the years of the philosophical inquiry, playwriting, his relationship with Wollstonecraft, had begun to fade away, giving way to financial anxieties and a consciousness of his own responsibilities. These included his daughter Mary, her sister Fanny, Wollstonecraft's child with Imlay, as well as 2 children brought into the marriage by Mary Jane, and the Godwins would also have a child of their own, William, born in 1803. Perhaps prompted by this houseful of children, spurred on too by an awareness that the juvenile book market was burgeoning, the Godwins decided to establish themselves in the field of books for education. And that's probably thanks to the expertise of Mary Jane, who'd worked for Thomas Hanway and who undoubtedly helped to shape the direction of the juvenile library. And she brought Eliza Fenwick to work for them too, who she'd worked with in previous book-selling capacities. So the first publication of the juvenile library was Fables Ancient and Modern. And the fable would be of key importance to the bookshop. It embodies a sort of imaginative, very sympathetic storytelling the Godwins felt was important to facilitate education. Fables emphasises Godwin's practice of thinking through the language which might be likely to amuse the child and make what I was talking of take hold upon his attention. And as recent scholarship has uncovered, like John Eric Hansen's excellent thesis, although the Godwins' venture into bookselling has often been dismissed, it was actually deeply important, a considered materialisation of Godwin's reflections on the most socially and psychologically beneficial forms of children's reading. His writing and publishing for children may be seen as a distillation of his larger thoughts on educational theories and his experimentation with genre. William and Mary Jane Godwin opened their juvenile library in summer 1805. The bookshop was first in Hanway Street, an alley off Oxford Street, part funded by a generous loan from Thomas Wedgwood. And thanks to Godwin's own notoriety at the period, it's actually registered under the name of their manager, Hodgkins. And here's an example of one of their early publications, one of these very small copperplate books. By 1807, Hodgkins had been caught thieving and was sacked in the May of that year. So the business was then re-registered under the name of Mary Jane Godwin, and the bookshop and the family moved to a new home, 41 Skinner Street, Holborn. Both shops seem to have been situated in somewhat run-down neighbourhoods. In Hanway Street, the courts are said to be ruinous, occupied by the very poor of the worst description. That's just a little example of another Hanway Street copperplate book. One of the later ones, March 1806. Then you can see between these two editions of the Lamb, so the Tales shows the Hanway Street address. By the time Mrs. Lester's School is published, the bookshop has moved to 41 Skinner Street. Skinner Street was a thoroughfare on Snow Hill, which had only been built in 1807, but seems to have been a rather melancholy and unsuccessful speculation. It was already doomed to decay when Godwin moved his juvenile library into it in 1807. William Harvey, writing as Aleph, recalled the exciting appearance of the bookshop which he'd seen in his youth. It boasted an immense extent of window front extending from the entrance into Snow Hill and towards Fleet Market. Many a time have I lingered with loving eyes over those fascinating storybooks, so rich in gaily coloured prints, such careful editions of the marvellous old histories, Puss in Boots, Cock Robin, Cinderella and the like. Fortunately, the front was kept low, so as exactly to suit the capacity of a childish admirer. But he also recalls that Skinner Street was quite disreputable, with the periodic presence of a hangman's gibbet on the corner of Giltsford Street nearby. Who that could help it would live in Skinner Street? So that's a sort of little context for understanding what the first appearance of the Lamb's children's works. And I think Godwin's approach to the child reader is shaped both by this commercial enterprise and by his education at the Hoxton Academy, which encouraged an indefatigable search after truth and enabled him to form a pedagogical theory of his own. So he talks at length about this of choice in reading, where he says that you should trust the child in a certain degree with himself. Suffer him in some instances to select his own course of reading. Suffer him to wander in the wilds of literature. So these are the sorts of views which lie behind Lamb's comment about the child needing to be fed by tales, a shared belief in the autonomy of the child reader, and the importance of imagination, but underneath it, a very practical sense of what might actually appeal to that child reader and the different sorts of books, both pleasurable and didactic, that might be offered to them. So here's a little overview of what was on offer from the Juvenile Library in 1806: copperplate books, 1 shilling books of education, life writing and history, and 6-penny books, tales from Shakespeare. So just in closing, I want to turn to 2 examples of the lamb's sympathetic interest in the imaginative response of the child, but also how they fit it into this framework of the child's book market in the period. So the first one I'd like us to look at is Mrs. Lester's School, a book of 10 linked short stories, the majority by Mary Lamb. And the tales give a particular insight into Mary as writer. It's a very delicate, sensitive, emotionally acute work, I think. The whole premise of the book is that the chapters are narrated by children who've all just arrived at a new boarding school, solitary young strangers who are encouraged into biographical conversations by their new teacher, who acts as their amanuensis, writing down their life stories, endeavouring to preserve as exactly as I could your own words and your own peculiarities of style and manner. It's an intriguing way both of giving authority to the child, but also of socialising them. In several of the tales, the child narrators evoke Robinson Crusoe. Coming to school has been a way of leaving their solitary state behind, of cultivating them. I was let grow up wild like an ill weed and thrived accordingly, as the child narrator of The Witch Ant puts it. Here, from the frontispiece of the book, is an image of one of those children, the narrator of the first story, Elizabeth Villiers. Just as in Barbaulds' Lessons for Children, we begin the collection with a homely scene of a mother teaching her child its letters, but with a difference. The first thing I can remember was my father teaching me the alphabet from the letters on a tombstone that stood at the head of my mother's grave. I used to tap at my father's study door. I think I now hear him say, "Who is there? What do you want, little girl? Go and see Mama. Go and learn pretty letters." Many times in the day would my father lay aside his books and his papers to lead me to this spot. He would point to the letters and set me to spell syllables and words. And in this manner, the epitaph on my mother's tomb being my primer and my spelling book, I learned to read. And she then tells the other children about a gradual realization of a world beyond this scene as her sailor uncle comes to visit. The uncle returns from a long voyage, eager to greet his sister, but meets his little niece outside the house and allows her to show him the way. I agreed to take him to Mama. We had a dispute about the way thither. At last I stopped at my mother's grave and pointing to the tombstone said, "Here is Mama," in a voice of exultation. But oh, what a face of sorrow did I see. It's a scene so close to We Are Seven, I think, in its depiction of the child's resistance to the rules of mourning. But unlike the child of We Are Seven, this girl is forced to understand sorrow and finality. Now I first learned that my mother's death was a heavy affliction. Each of the life stories is a tale of transition, rupture, crisis, grief, loss, even temporary madness, which is then overcome and resolved. For instance, in The Young Mahometan, the child narrator, the daughter of a housekeeper, is left unattended to roam the abandoned country house, finding her way into the library, feasting on Mahometism Explained, eventually reading herself into a fever at the thought of the doom awaiting non-believers. And the cure for too much solitary reading turns out to be a trip to Harlow Fair with the friendly doctor's wife and the cheerful sight of ribbons, laces, toys, cakes and sweetmeats, as well as the purchase of an entertaining geographical game. The mention of geography might just put us in mind of Lamb's earlier fulmination to Coleridge. Think of what you'd been now, being crammed with geography and natural history. But the Lamb's own works for children do show a lively awareness of the state of the children's book trade and the status of their own works in a competitive market. There's a good moment where the little girl of Visit to the Cousins is taken to the Juvenile Library in Skinner Street. Its address carefully given. Returning down Cheapside? Shall we order the coachman to the corner of St. Paul's churchyard? Shall we go to the juvenile library in Skinner Street? And Mamma said she would go to Skinner Street because she wanted to look at the new buildings there. Papa bought me 7 new books. So the lambs show themselves to be quite well aware of the rules of the trade, what's required of their educational works. The stories of Mrs. Leicester's school are those of socialisation, solitary children gradually learning the ways of social relationship, education, and yet in some ways still resisting them. Here's a moment of regret in the story of Susan Yates on first going to church, which sums up this movement between wildness and convention, when she recalls how happy she is going to St. Mary's Church. Before that day, I used to feel like a little outcast in the wilderness. But I can never hear the sweet noise of bells. I don't think of the angels singing and what poor but pretty thoughts I had of angels in my uninstructed solitude. There are losses to be endured as the child loses that uninstructed solitude, as they come in from the wilderness and submit, not always unquestioningly, to authority. These moments in Mrs. Leicester's school sum up for me something of the ways in which the lamb's work oscillates between the wild and the didactic. And to me, that reflects something of the ways in which the lambs themselves try to balance the pleasures and dangers of wildness. And in closing, I'm just going to turn to one single poem from the volume Poetry for Children, which is another nice example of the ways in which the lambs carefully negotiate the dangers of imagination. Poetry for Children is a very little known book, issued in 2 volumes in 1809, attributed to the author of Mrs. Leicester's School. And the poems aren't given precise attributions. They may even have been written together as the lambs worked on their single table. And often they feature a brother and a sister talking together, and quite often wrangling or quarrelling. And the back and forth between brother and sister is given humorous expression in one of the poems, What is Fancy? It's probably written by Mary Lamb, at least that's what Evie Lucas thought, but there's no precise evidence for that. Like many poems in the collection, it shows a brother and sister working together, 2 children debating their writing tasks. Sister, I am to write 3 lines and you 3 others that will rhyme. There, now I've done my task. Brother, 3 stupid lines as e'er I knew. When you've the pen next time, some question of me ask. Sister, then tell me, brother, and pray mind, brother, you tell me true, what sort of thing is fancy? Brother, by all that I can ever find, 'tis something that is very new, and what no dunces can see. Sister, that's not half the way to tell what fancy is about, so pray now, tell me more. Brother, sister, I think quite as well that you should find it out, so think the matter o'er. Sister, it's what comes in my head, our heads when we play at Let's Make Believe, and when we play at guessing. Brother, and I have often heard it said to be, a talent often makes us grieve, and sometimes proves a blessing. So this is a riddle which enacts its own lesson, not only teaching children about fancy, but encouraging its expression, offering a portrait of children experimenting with rhyme in order to prompt a child reader into response. The siblings' conversation suggests the importance of peer learning. The definition of fancy is produced through the back and forth of dialogue rather than from an authority figure. And indeed, the reader needs to guess at the overall meaning of the poem. Fancy or imagination is presented as an uncertain good. The sister's playful, pleasurable evocation of make-believe, followed up by the brother's note of warning as he rhymes it with grieve. We might recall Charles's brotherly care towards Mary, his one-time tutor in the extremes of her illness, and the necessary restraint of her fancy. Yet the poem ends ambivalently, its final word one of blessing, so that the pleasurable possibilities of imagination remain open for the children. The brother has the last word, but it's an uncertain one. Neither brother nor sister has authority in this poem, which represents a sort of world of their own. And it's hard to know who ultimately was responsible for writing this poem. So we began with Charles Lamb's outburst against educational literature by women. This sly poem reminds us to inquire more sceptically into a brother's hasty dismissal, and maybe to take more seriously women's educational writing of the period in all its diverse genres. Poetry for children provides us with a playful example of the ways in which educational taskwork and imaginative fancy, far from being opposed, were actually in dialogue with one another in the period. It's a good example of the way in which looking afresh at the forgotten children's writing of the Lambs might open up new perspectives on well-known romantic debates. I'm going to end there and open it for questions.
Oh, thank you, Felicity. I think. Well, that was terrific, and it really makes us thirsty for the edition. So thank you so much, Felicity. Okay, who would like to ask the first question, please?
And apologies again for forgetting to share my slides as I came back. I'm really sorry about that. But if there's anything people would like to have a look at in more detail, do let me know. Some of those illustrations are so intriguing, and there's such a difference between those gaily coloured chapbook illustrations and the classic Tales from Shakespeare and Adventures of Ulysses.
Okay, perhaps I could start with a question, which is, what do you think? What do you see as the principal motivations for the Lambs in writing the books? Fiscal, or spreading knowledge, or what? Why do you think they did it?
That's such a good question, John. It's a central one, because they do present it as being task work for money. Mary's letter to Sarah Stoddart, where she talks about writing the tales, is full of pride in how much money she's made, and about how this is a kind of independence for her. And yet they go to such trouble to keep copies of them, to send them to friends' children, and they take a pride in them which goes beyond simple task work. I think it is partly prompted by the close friendship with Godwin and a sort of expression of their friendship at that time, perhaps. They don't seriously want to make an intervention into educational debates and set themselves up as sort of experts in pedagogy, but they are profoundly interested in how the imagination of the child can be represented and can be developed, I think. So it's a really good question. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's one that we need to keep returning to and thinking through. I think a really complex answer.
Thank you very much. I've actually got another question, and it's not really about Lamb. It's about the Godwins and Godwin in particular. I mean, I'm very interested in the kind of afterlife of radicals. And when you think about the kind of common line on William Hone is that he stops being tried for libel and writing these magnificent satires. That he does these mere antiquarian works, everyday book and etc. And that this is somehow kind of, he's turning his face away from the fire, that he's quietist. And Hunt does all of those kind of, he tells fairy stories and he writes kind of soppy poetry and so on. And Godwin, Matthew Grenby, in his book on children's literature of the period, it really does say that this is Godwin's quietest moment. He doesn't have any stomach for a radical fight anymore. So what does he do? He ends up publishing children's literature. So he really sees Godwin's work here as a politically quietest moment. So
I would. Yeah, I think there is a way of looking at the children's literature that sees it as playing out a different form of political action, really thinking about the role of education, a very early education too, thinking about how the child can be encouraged into sympathy, thinking about how social change might be affected in ways other than direct action, I suppose. So thinking about the children's works as part of that larger picture, considering the same questions, but putting them into practice in a very different way, is an interesting angle on it, I think. However, just like with the lambs, it's partly a way that he thinks he will make money, of course. And it's hard to tell exactly how successful he was. And in part, I think some choices of printing, so he goes for quite lavish printing sometimes. He often uses several printers, and he never seems to have made it the sort of roaring business success that he intended. But it does bump along for quite a long time. And he certainly encourages some interesting people into writing for him. So it's a really interesting question. Is it a retreat, withdrawal? Partly. But is it also a way of staying engaged in a slightly different way? I think that is a part of the motivation for him. Yeah. And going right back, I think, to his dissenting education, his own dissenting education, and seeing himself as part of that tradition of dissenting educators as well, kind of larger social purpose, perhaps, that Lamb also may have been sympathetic to. Right.
I think there are ways of reading those books in a political way. The Pantheon, for example, is a pretty piece of paganism, isn't it, really? And Godwin is saying something, it seems to me, about comparative religion in an interesting way.
Yes. And yet at the same time, he's trying to weigh that against the pressures of the children's commercial book market. It's a serious, he's attempting to seriously rival tub art, and to think about how he can attract his share of the market.
Indeed, yeah, and Ben scrounging from his son-in-law as well as a way of raising funds. Right, first up we've got Greg with a question, and then Jane, please.
Thank you. Good. Yeah, whoops, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Felicity. That was fantastic. Really good. Still feels so new, all of this. Such a new field you're opening up, really, in relation to the Lamb's work. I suppose it's another question about Godwin, really. I mean, for what it's worth, I wonder John's question about, that question about radical selling out. It remains an interesting one in relation to people like Hone and Godwin and so on. But I wonder whether it isn't also that the bottom has fallen out of the radical market in a way, that it's not, it's that there's nowhere, there's the opportunities for publication on those big issues have evaporated. So it isn't always that they've just got off the train, it's that the train stopped moving and they had to find another one. I mean, I don't know if you understand it, or if that makes any sense, the distinction. So I wonder whether these tactical transferals are often impelled. They're not sort of purely willed. But again, obviously, it would depend on circumstances and so on. But I suppose it was a question about Godwin. I mean, that in the late 1790s, Lamb thinks of Godwin as, the atheist philosopher. He's the enemy insofar, or he's one of the enemies. Insofar as Lamb has any, it's possible that Matravis or some of the villains in some of Lamb's early poetry and drama, it's probably not Godwin. It's not Godwin personified, but certain kind of radical utilitarian, a sort of demoralized form of improvement is what's being targeted, and yet within a few years. Well, half a decade, as it were, they're beginning to collaborate. And from what you've shown as well, is they're collaborating in a very sympathetic way. You know, that Lamb has. How would you put that sort of transition, or that change?
It's one of the reasons I'm so intrigued by Lamb. That change, that absolute change, when he's had those Godwinian villains, and yet when he meets the man himself in a sort of domestic setting, that I dined with the atheist, he changes his mind. And that ability to change and to accept the sort of the complexity of the individual, and that they have aspects that he disagrees with, but they also have human qualities that he sympathizes with. That's a very Lamb moment, kind of able to balance his annoyance with Coleridge against his love for him. So I think there's a transformation that goes on when he meets Godwin the man. And in a way, he's got quite a tolerant and just amused approach to Godwin's philosophy. He never takes it quite seriously, and he doesn't quite take the playwriting seriously as well, I think, for all his involvement in it. Yet he's clearly got a respect and an admiration for some of Godwin's personal ideals, I think.
Oh, that sounds.
So I really feel like the juvenile library stuff, that's why I say it's not simply task work. It comes out of that friendship and conversation with Godwin. It's attempting to participate in what he's trying to do, as well as to make some money.
Yeah, because the way you were rendering it, it's as if there is really a deep sympathy between the way that Godwin imagines these books as, you know, what their purpose might be in a general sense, and what the Lambs then go on to do in specific cases. Are there examples of sort of personal or individual tension where you feel like it's actually two very different pedagogic models at work, or actually, in fact, they're surprisingly well aligned?
I don't want to render it as a kind of completely coherent model, because I don't think the juvenile library is a entirely coherent pedagogic plan at all. I suppose what I want to suggest is that there are surprisingly many points of sympathy and parallels, and we might think of the two being quite different, but actually there are moments of sympathy born, I think, from this larger dissenting heritage, or sympathy with dissent. So that's where I would see it coming from. And there are certainly divergences, and maybe I need to play those up a little more, because I don't want to suggest that it is a kind of homogenous or sort of they're working perfectly together. But I do think that there are moments where their ideas of the child come quite close.
Thank you.
Okay, Jane, please.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Felicity. What a great paper. I loved it. And I have a question about what we know. What do we know about the reading practices and reception of the works for children? Now, I was thinking about Mary Lamb's correspondence with Dorothy Wordsworth, and whether there's any evidence that the Wordsworths sat down with their own children and read the tales, and actually who did sit down with the children, if that's how they were read. Was it women, or, as I so strongly suspect it was, or was it the father figures as well? And did they enjoy them? And then I wondered whether there's anything in the tales that contemporary children would like to read about. Are these tales in any way serviceable for a 21st century child, or, you know, are they just caught in their own moment, do you think?
Such good, yeah, so that's such a good pair of questions, Jane. Really interesting. Who read them? I'm still thinking about that, and I'd love to know. I'd love to gather more evidence about who actually did read these. They were repeatedly reprinted So there clearly is a market. I'm thinking particularly here about the tales from Shakespeare, which are issued in little sixpenny books and were very widely reprinted. We know because of the wear on the prints on the later versions. So I don't have any direct evidence of child readers yet, but I do know that they were widely in circulation. Interestingly, it's not always in a domestic setting. An important part of the Godwin's market was schools. And that's, in fact, how poetry for children ends up surviving. It never gets reprinted as a volume, but the poems within it are reprinted numerous times in educational anthologies, sort of reading books and sort of elocution anthologies, and they have a long life through the 19th century. So I think perhaps the answer to the question is that we need to think about child reading as and the Lamb's works as existing in an educational setting as well, and that's perhaps the key to their long survival, especially the tales, I think. Although we do have evidence for Mary Cowden Clarke having read the tales, actually, and they do seem to have influenced her. Are they suitable for a modern child audience? Well, I can tell you that from my small sample of 2 children, no. but so I have tried them. Barbauld went down better, I have to say. They really liked the lessons for children and the way they're quite simple words. They liked the nursery rhymes, but the tales from Shakespeare, they found very puzzling. Oh, Helen is saying that she read tales from Shakespeare as a child in the 1990s. And it's remarkable how often it gets reprinted. And yet, I think it's quite tough going for the child and often leaves quite important scenes out in the interest of condensing and making more, making suitable. So Helen, do tell us what you thought of the tales yourself.
Yes, I found some of them really quite tough going, at least to begin with. When I'm trying to think how old I was maybe 7 or something when I was given them, and certainly found them a bit tough. The idea was that then I and my siblings would reread the relevant one when we went to see either a children's version or the full version of the play. And definitely it was useful to have at least sort of some idea of the outline. But when I was a bit older, I would be frantically kind of skimming through it before we went to the theatre, thinking this is going to be a good sort of easy synopsis, and that's really not what they are. But I think as long as you take them on their own terms as a tale taken from Shakespeare, rather than rather than thinking they're going to be a synopsis like you might find in a program or something, then they're enjoyable.
They've had a remarkably long afterlife in the colonies. That was often what they were used for, and they to go out as a kind of version of Shakespeare, so often used in colonial exams, and then to, as I said in the introduction, they were the means by which Shakespeare was first introduced into China. There were also Swahili versions of them, and yet these seem to be a sort of almost a kind of misapprehension of what they're doing, that they're not actually a very faithful synopsis of what's going on in the Shakespeare plays, but a sort of weird Elian version, I mean, mostly by Mary, but a kind of Elian version of the important moments from Shakespeare. So I give them to children with caution, perhaps. So your children may be more cultured than mine, but yes, certainly it's fallen on somewhat stony ground, I can say here.
Yeah. Right. Thank you very much, Felicity and And on that bombshell, let's pause. Let's thank Felicity for her wonderful paper, and all are welcome to the annual general meeting, which will begin at 3:10. But let's thank Felicity once again for a marvelous paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the lovely questions too.
Okay, colleagues.